There's a reason why people don't want to live in the middle of nowhere. When you live in the middle of nowhere, you avoid all the problems caused by people, but you also lose all the good things caused by people. Just the fact that people will pay a lot to live in cities despite the traffic and the noise and the pollution and the
Yeah.
bad manners. It's a sign that there's a package. There's all the bad things people do, all the good things people do, and people actually, despite their complaining, they rate the package as a positive. And that's something that gets completely lost in housing regulation.
So we're joined by Bryan Caplan. He is soon to be author of a housing book coming out called Build Baby Build. He is a professor at George Mason University. We're really thankful that you came on the Think Brazos podcast, and let's talk about this book a little bit and what you're working.
Great. So the book is called Build Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. It is the most fascinating book ever written on housing regulation, I assure you. What makes me so confident? Well, probably because it is in the format of a graphic novel. So it's a comic book.
Okay.
But it's a comic book where I try to take a pile of fantastic, important research that is too boring for almost anyone on earth to read.
Sure.
And then put it all together between two covers and paint a big picture about how we can have a much better world if we just stop viewing the construction industry as criminals and instead realize they're providing a very useful service and we're regulating them to death. If we would just go and take the pile of crazy regulations we have and say, government is the problem. It's got to go and deregulate so that the industry can produce a pile of cheap housing, all of the great stuff that comes along with that.
So this is pretty uncommon, it seems, that you would have a graphic novel about economics. Is this the first time that you've tried something like this? Or?
I have one other one on immigration. So that one's
Okay.
called Open Borders, the Science and Ethics of Immigration.
Got it.
It's the same idea where academics, they produce some very intriguing work.
Mhm.
They do sometimes work on trivial questions that nobody cares about, but sometimes they write papers that are extremely important that change your view of the world, or they would if you would read them.
Yeah.
But almost no one's going to read them. And part of what I try to do is say, well, how can I get people to actually care about this important research? How can I communicate it? How can I make you realize that the individual papers that seem like they're on a picky topic actually all go together
Kinda
to
connect.
form an edifice?
Yeah.
Right? It's just like with building any major structure. It's like, it's just a brick. It's like, well, you put the bricks together and you get a big picture.
So let's hear the kind of the synopsis of the book or your findings and kind of a picture of your theories.
Right. Well, so here's a good way of thinking about this. We know how housing prices worked from say 1890 on. From some countries, it goes back a year earlier. The normal way that housing markets work is this. Every now and then demand goes up, prices go up.
Sure.
But then when prices go up, they are greater than cost. Industry then says, oh, prices are greater than cost. Let's go build more. And they start building more and keep building more until prices go back down to cost. And that's the normal way that markets work all around the world until about 40 or 50 years ago, when prices go up, well, they go up and they go up. Sometimes they go down a bit and then they keep going up again. And why?
Yeah.
So this is a question that has gotten a lot of researchers interested. And I'm just going to say this is not an ideological answer. This is a consensus answer from people with a lot of different political views. Just that housing regulation has gotten so strict that industry is not able to go and just start building a lot of extra homes when the price is high. Instead, when the price is high, people in the industry say, hey, we really want to build more homes. And government says, well, funny thing is you should ask that. You can, if you complied with the following list of regulations, and that list is so long that it takes the profit out of actually doing it. And we get in a situation where very few things get built, and then people feel like the market isn't working. The kind of regulations you have to deal with. Well, in cities, it's just super hard to build tall buildings. The physical construction of a skyscraper is not hard. The Empire State Building was built in a year in an earlier time when regulators were not trying to crush the industry. All right. So also multifamily housing, it's easy to build. The technology's been around for over 100 years. We got better technology, not worse than they had back then. Really easy to do. And then the one that we were talking about earlier, that's really crazy is it's normal to say there's a minimum amount of land you have to build.
Right.
And in a lot of areas now, like mine, it's minimum 1 acre per house. All right. That means that the price of homes gets really high. 'Cause- And you're like, and why? Well, like people like land, they like it a bit, but when a developer has a large tract of land and they're free to go and put as many houses on as they want, they normally only use a very modest amount of land because people aren't willing to pay that much extra for the land, but they
Right.
are willing to pay a lot to have a house.
And they don't want to have to mow it. So.
Yeah. Like it's free, people usually
Yeah,
take it.
that's
So
true.
the mowing is, it's an issue, but it's not the main issue. The
Yeah,
main
right.
issue is just that the regulators don't like the idea of squeezing a lot of homes onto a small amount of land. There is this suspicion of, you're just trying to do this to make money. It's like, well, in the pursuit of money, I wind up producing a pile of homes that people live in. So why are you bringing down my neck with such hostility?
Yeah. So, in the book, from what you've talked about at your lecture at A&M last night, as well as when we talked earlier this week, you talk about the concept of panacea. Can we
Yes,
go into that?
sure.
Because I think it's
Yeah. So one of the coolest things about this issue, one of the reasons I wanted to write a book is that there's, well, besides the obvious benefit of deregulation is getting housing prices down.
right.
And actually, this is where the quantitative work is relevant because it really does look like averaging over the whole US, the prices are now at about double the actual physical cost of production.
Mm.
So if you were to deregulate a lot, then in the long run, you really should expect prices to fall by about 50%. All right. So that's a pretty big result. And when you think about it more, it's like, well, it's not just making housing cheap. It's also making a big dent in, or what's the other way around. It's giving a big boost to living standards because housing is a big part of your budget.
Right.
So if you cut the price of chewing gum in half, it doesn't really raise living standards much. But housing generally absorbs about 20% of a typical person's budget. So if you cut the price of that in half, that is cutting the cost of living by 10%, which means you're raising living standards by 11%. Do the math. All right. So there's all that stuff. That's all really cool. But a lot of the reason why I wanted to write a book is that there were a bunch of other papers saying that there's a bunch of add-on benefits of this. It's not just about making cheap housing and raising living standards. You also get a bunch of other problems where at least you can diminish them. The word panacea, it means a cure-all. It's an exaggeration, of course, but I like the poetry of it. It comes from Greek mythology, Panacea, the Greek goddess of universal remedy. But some of the social problems that housing deregulation just simultaneously takes a chunk out of. So inequality, a lot of people are concerned about rising inequality. And yet the idea that this has something to do with housing was usually lost on people, but the logic is very clear. Housing is a larger share of the budget of poor people. So
Sure.
if you cut the price of something by a constant percentage, but some people are spending a larger share of their money on it, it raises the living standards more. So put that together and you realize this is actually something that would substantially reduce inequality. On top of that, tenants are usually poorer than owners. And for tenants, cutting housing prices is a pure gain. For owners, it's a mixed blessing. Right? Many people think that it's an unmitigated harm to homeowners, but it's not. What if you're in a starter home and you want to upgrade? It's like, well, do you want all housing prices to be sky high? It's like, well, then you're going to be stuck in your starter home forever. Or, simply suppose that you want to subdivide or sell it to a developer. Well, in that case, regulation is bad for you. What if you want your kids to live within 50 or 100 miles of you? Well, if prices are too high, they're not going to. Or what if you don't want your kid to live in your basement for his whole life? All right, well, big reason people live in their parents' basement is because housing prices are high in the area where they live. All right, so inequality is something we can make a big dent in. Social mobility, another major add-on. Traditionally in the United States, there's a very easy way that a person that wanted a better life could do it for themselves, which is just move to a high-wage area of the country.
Right.
This totally worked in the past. Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath notwithstanding, that's just fiction. But normally you can do this now. Not everybody wanted to, but if you wanted to, it was there. Get in your car, drive to a high-wage part of the country and have a better life.
Right.
Why was this possible? Because in the old days, housing prices didn't vary very much by area. So you move from Mississippi to California, get a much higher wage, housing prices are a little bit more, and you pocket the difference thanks to your willingness to try something different.
Right.
In the modern economy, it no longer works that way. In the modern economy, the problem is that while there are plenty of areas where they've got extra high wages, they also now have extra high housing prices. When you crunch the numbers, you realize moving to San Francisco is a way for most people to get poorer. You get a higher wage, but the housing cost eats up more than 100% of your raise. So don't move to San Francisco if you want to get rich. If we would deregulate, we could go back to this older system where there was this great option for upper mobility for anyone that's willing to do it. Not everybody wants to, but at least you could. And a lot of people did take advantage of that. There was a reason why California is the most populous state. It was not always so. People moved there in order to enjoy that better package. And now it's not such a great package because of those housing costs.
So going into that a little bit more. So do you actually think that reducing or removing a lot of these regulations could bring us possibly back to a situation like what you're talking about, grapes of wrath example, or is it, are we past?
The grapes of wrath is
Right. Because it's not a, not a great
Steinbeck was a communist, but of course nothing can work out for anybody if they just try to improve their own life in America.
But the concept of moving, the way things were before, you think that it is possible?
Yeah, well, like it's not just possible. Like it's clear if you were to do this. The only real doubt is, well, is it really true that allowing people to build more housing cuts housing prices? And that's where I'll just say, this is not an ideological claim. It's not a political claim. Almost everybody who just looks at the arguments and the numbers with an open mind comes away saying, yeah, well, common sense is right. If you build more stuff, it gets cheaper. Not because developers say, well, since you were nice enough to let me build stuff, I'm going to be nice and I'm going to make it affordable. That's not how markets work. The way markets work is I was allowed to build a lot of stuff. Now, how do I get customers? I've got a giant apartment complex. If I just go and charge the same price everybody else is charging, why should anybody move to my new place? No, I'm going to cut the price.
Right.
And that's how it works in the real world. When you want to sell something and you've got a lot, and there is abundance, you cut the price in order to go and fill your units. That's not fantasy. It's not ideology. It's common sense. And it's what the data say.
So really what you're getting into here is the concept of filtering, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
where even if, I think you mentioned last night in your talk that even if a developer builds something that is for the very rich, there's this filtering effect that happens. And so,
filtering or chain reaction. In my book, I describe it as musical chairs, except it's musical chairs where you add chairs instead of subtracting chairs.
Okay.
All right. So the usual game, musical chairs, it gets harder and harder to find a place. You have to get faster and faster because chairs are going down. If there's more chairs than people, then you don't need to struggle so much. So just every time you add a chair, it might be a really nice chair. So that's the chair that the fastest runner goes to, but it still frees up other chairs. Really, and here's the clear thing. People who have lower income live in older housing. That housing was, when it was first built, at its peak, probably. Right. And yes, over time, housing filters down. Joseph, that reverse musical chairs analogy is very nice. The other thing worth pointing out is actually most regulations actually specifically make it harder and less desirable to go and build any kind of affordable housing. The minimum lot size is really clear, right? Because every house has to be on an acre. What kind of house would you build on an acre? You're not going to build a tiny house on an acre. People are going to say, I'm not going to pay for acres worth of land plus this tiny house. So when you've got a high minimum lot size, you put mansions there, and then that people are priced out. If someone had 10 acres and they can either put 10 mansions or 50 affordable homes, at least they're thinking which one is going to make more money, and they're doing the math. Like, well, it depends. Like, it's much easier for the numbers to come out that way. Same thing, of course, for multifamily housing. Multifamily housing tends to be cheaper. And it's something that builders generally would love to build because they make so much more money per unit of land, per dollar invested. It's just so hard to get permission to do it. Something like 80% of all residential land in the U.S. is zoned for single family, which means if a builder could go and get the regulators say, okay, well, this one can be multifamily, and cha-ching, I will now go and put an apartment complex there.
Yeah.
Not, of course, in the middle of nowhere, not in a rural area are you going to do that. But if the regulation matters, then, and if like there actually is some desire to go and do multifamily, but you can't do it, then if you get permission, you do it. And that is a large increase in the supply of affordable housing.
So let's talk about policy prescriptions. We're filming here in College Station, Texas. There's a lot of talk over the years about a lot of Californians moving to
Yeah.
Texas for affordability issues. From the Texas
Mhm.
perspective, a lot of us would like to think, okay, how can we make sure we don't become
Mhm.
California? We mentioned minimum lot size, but what are some other in your research policy prescriptions that you think could help policymakers to make sure that that doesn't happen and we don't end up
Mhm.
pushing people from Texas to
Yeah.
Mississippi and so on?
I mean, the good news is that even though Texans are worried about Californians, the actual research says the typical person who moves to Texas is more Texan than the Texans.
Okay.
Right. So the Californians are exception. You're thinking, so the Californians are going to move to Austin. And it's like, all right, Austin is already so California. The Californians may actually make it a bit less so just because the Austins are more Catholic than the Pope,
Yeah.
as the saying goes. So, anyway, what can you do? Um, it is a democracy. So yes, if people show up who just think that your status quo is terrible and you don't change their minds, then that is a problem. One good piece of news is there's normally a lot of assimilation. At least the kids and people that come from other places usually assimilate to the place where they're going. You know, another part is normally when people arrive in a new place, the first idea is not to go and transform the politics of the local area. Every now and then there is a person who does think that, but that is pretty rare. I mean, honestly, I think the best thing to do is to embrace what you're doing right. What's pretty striking is that the places in the United States with the lowest housing regulation seems to me like it's mostly from default.
Mhm.
It's always been that way. That's the way it's going to be. When I'm in places like Texas, I had the privilege of spending a good part of COVID in Texas
Okay.
and enjoying the freedom here.
Yeah.
But what is striking about it is that, like, other than other friends of mine that are into this stuff, doesn't seem like people in Texas are sitting around saying, like, we're so proud of our really light housing regulation. Right. And why not? Why not be proud of doing something right? So part of what I'm trying to do with Build Baby Build is to tell people that do have lower regulation, there's a reason why things are good where you are. It's because your policies are good, right? First of all, at least don't go and make policy worse. But second of all,
Right.
if you become consciously aware that you're doing something right, then it also is much easier to say, well, could we get more right?
Yeah.
Could we actually move even further?
Mm.
Right? Sort of like, what can we do to be as unlike California as possible? All right. It's like whatever they're doing, let's do the opposite. So
Yeah.
that is a way that you could get people to feel pride in their success rather than to say, what's the alternative? The alternative is to be straight up like California.
Yeah. And we don't want that. With the couple minutes that we have left, is there anything that we have missed? And I want to talk about specifics about your book as far as how people can buy it when it comes
Okay.
out and all of that.
All right. Sounds good. Why does all this regulation exist if it's so terrible? A lot of people will just want to say, well, it's just greedy homeowners who don't want their home prices going down. That's actually seems to be wrong. When we go and actually ask people their opinions, people who rent are also very much in favor of regulation. I don't think that it is primarily people trying to go and defend defend their advantages. I think that it's more of the way the politics usually works, which is it's a worldview. It's a philosophy about how to make your society good. And I think that housing regulation comes from that place of people saying, how can we make this town, this state, this country a good place for people to live? And then if your answer is crush housing, that's the way to make things good, then you're going to do it. Now, of course, almost no one's going to say, let's crush housing, but rather what they're going to say is, there's a list of every single problem with housing. Let's pass laws to solve all the problems so that anything that's built is perfect.
Right.
That's more of the mentality that people have.
Okay.
So when I say, so like regulation exists because people think the world would be worse without it. And a lot of what I try to do in the book is say, wrong. The world is worse on balance because of the regulation. Sometimes there are genuine problems with construction, but there's just a much cheaper and more humane way of dealing with it. Like when you say, well, if we allow construction, we need more traffic, more parking, that's true. But there is a much better way of dealing with traffic and parking problems, which basically involves getting an app on one of these devices that some of you may have seen and saying that if you want to go and drive or park to repeat times, you have to pay extra money.
Yeah.
This does go and make the price of driving and parking to repeat times higher. That's the point of it. But when people, the reaction is like, that's not fair to the poor. It's like, is it fair to the poor that it costs $1 million to buy a house? Isn't it much better to have housing be cheap and then you have to pay $1 to park if you really want to park during a busy time? It's a much more sensible approach to traffic and parking problems to just charge for those. And we can do a great job of it now because in the middle of the night, there's no reason to charge. There's only a reason to charge during the times when a lot of people are doing it. We've got the algorithms to make this work fantastically. And yet people would much rather crush housing than just go and charge people a little bit more to park and drive. Part of what I say is like, stop with this horrible attitude. Like there's nothing wrong with charging people to park and drive. That's just the kind of thing that it makes the most sense to charge people for at peak time. On the other hand, to say that housing has to cost an arm and a leg because otherwise it'll cause these other problems is crazy. Then there are, other problems where I think that people just exaggerating their severity. People can get very self-righteous about a bird nest.
Yeah.
When it's like, well, okay, fine, there's a bird nest, but there's 20 families that want to live here. So I think the 20 families are more part of the bird nest. There's a lot of birds. Like, why that bird? Why is that a special bird? So that's another thing that I think is important to keep in mind. Let's see. Like the other big thing that people tend to forget when they're thinking about all the problems that housing causes, now it's important to go and make sure that no housing built causes any problems, is that housing also causes good things. Like most obviously, like your neighbor moves in and they got a kid and your kid can play with that kid.
Right.
All right. It's a simple point, but there's a reason why people don't want to live in the middle of nowhere. When you live in the middle of nowhere, you avoid all the problems caused by people.
Sure.
It's true. But you also lose all the good things caused by people. Just the fact that people will pay a lot to live in cities despite the traffic and the noise and the pollution and the bad manners. It's a sign that there's a package. There's all the bad things people do, all the good things people do, and people actually, despite their complaining, they rate the package of everything good plus minus everything bad as a positive. And that's something that gets completely lost in housing regulation. Because you're never going to have someone go to a meeting and say, let's talk about all the good things this is going to bring, unless it's the builder. It's like, the builder, who cares what the builder has to say? But it's just true. It's true that when more people live in an area, you've got more shopping opportunities, more entertainment opportunities, more social opportunities, more job opportunities. So, it's important to go and remember all that stuff when you're hearing someone complain about housing and say, look, even if you're right, it is a totally one-sided, pessimistic picture. And what we're going to do if we listen to you is what we've done, which is just make it hard to build stuff.
And I like the comment you made last night at your talk is basically the people coming to City Hall and complaining about a new development. They could actually be opposing their kid's future friend at school, keeping him from being there. So it's
the
interesting.
Person who goes to a meeting tends to be a pessimistic person.
Right.
With a chip on their shoulder. No offense to any super optimistic town meeting viewers.
Sure.
But right now on the question of where you can get it. You should be able to get it in physical bookstores. I generally get stuff from Amazon, but there's, as you know, there's all kinds of places. Amazon's discounting it right now. So that's probably what I would do.
Perfect.
But anyway, so the book is, so you can pre-order it right now and the book will be available starting on Wednesday. And maybe this interview will be airing after Wednesday or on Wednesday?
Yeah, I think it'll be a few days after that, but we'll make sure to put it out.
So in that case, everyone out there in podcast land, it's available.
Yes. And so, again, we really appreciate Bryan Caplan coming on our podcast and talking about his new book coming out, Build, Baby, Build. So, Bryan, thanks a lot. It's been fun.
All right. My pleasure. Thank you very much.